All right, get ready, because today we're going deep into a case that'll have you looking over your shoulder at your own family. Just picture it, a murder mystery, and the main suspects are identical twins. Sounds like a TV drama, right? But this is real life.
It really is a story about families, secrets, and the difficulty of finding justice when the evidence is hazy, to say the least.
We're talking about Heather DeWild. Vanished in 2003, gone just like that. Her family immediately suspected her husband, Dan.
And they weren't just guessing. Investigators picked up on some strange things right off the bat. Like, get this, Dan hired a lawyer before anyone even knew Heather was missing.
That's odd, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not the usual move for a worried husband.
You got that right.
And to make things even trickier, Heather's dad was a seasoned cop. He knew the ins and outs of investigations, not a guy you'd want to mess with.
No doubt about it. His experience pushed him to uncover what happened to his daughter. But even with his background, this case was a real head-scratcher.
So let's rewind to the beginning. What were the early clues that made the police zero in on Dan?
Well, first off, Dan's story didn't add up. He said Heather went shopping, but there was zero proof of that. No money or credit cards missing, and nobody saw her at any stores.
So his alibi crumbles right away. Did the investigators find anything at their house that might explain what happened?
No signs of a fight or forced entry. At first, it seemed like maybe she left willingly, but then her bank accounts and credit cards were untouched. Poof, gone without a trace.
And then you have the twin, David. A cadaver dog got a hit on his Suburban, throwing a whole new wrench into the case.
Yep, the idea that Heather's body could have been in David's car changed everything. Suddenly, both brothers were under suspicion.
And if that wasn't suspicious enough, one day after that dog sniffed out his car, David up and marries his girlfriend, Roseanne. What's that all about?
The timing, it does make you wonder, doesn't it? Roseanne said it was just a coincidence. But the police had to consider if it was a way to protect David or even Roseanne from the investigation. Marriage, it comes with legal shields, like not having to testify against each other, which could really slow things down.
So we've got a shady husband, a twin with a brand new wife, and a missing woman. What happened next in the investigation?
Weeks later, Heather's car pops up, abandoned in a parking lot. Someone had scrubbed it clean inside and out like they were trying to make her disappear completely. But even with the deep clean, they found a few things in the car that became really important later.
Ooh, now I'm hooked. What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Remember that adult film we talked about? The investigators found a tape, the kind Dan and Heather made years ago.
Okay, well, lay it on me. What was on that tape?
Well, it showed Dan tying Heather up, and the way he tied her up was almost exactly like how her body was eventually found. It wasn't just a coincidence. It hinted at something darker, a need to control maybe. It really creeped out the whole task force.
That's disturbing. I could see why that would raise red flags. Anything else they found that pointed to Dan?
They found an online dating profile, and guess what? Dan had made it, calling himself a widower.
No way.
And the kicker is, he made this profile before they even found Heather's body.
Whoa, that's a huge red flag. Seems like he planned it all out. But couldn't you say that making that profile was his way of dealing with grief?
You could, and that's actually what the defense tried to argue later. But when you put it all together, the tape, the profile, his lies at the start, it starts to look pretty bad.
Yeah, things are not looking good for Dan. So at this point, the investigation is all about him. But they still haven't found a body or any solid proof that directly links him to Heather's disappearance.
Exactly. It was like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces that just wouldn't fit. And then, bam, a twist nobody expected.
All right, here's where it gets really interesting.
In 2012, 9 years after Heather vanished, David confessed.
Wait, he confessed. What did he confess to? Did he say he killed Heather?
He said he helped get rid of her body after, according to him, Dan killed her.
Hold on. Whoa. So now we have a confession, but it implicates both brothers. This is getting more twisted by the minute. What happened next?
Well, this confession flipped the investigation on its head. It was a possible break in the case, but it also made things way more complicated. The police had to figure out if David was telling the truth or just trying to protect himself or maybe someone else. And then there's Roseanne, his wife. Did she know anything, or was she involved somehow?
I wish we could just jump to the end and find out the truth, but okay, let's take it step by step. What exactly did David tell the police about the night Heather disappeared?
He gave them a very specific story about what happened leading up to Heather's death, and he claimed Dan planned the whole thing. David said that Dan tricked Heather into going to the garage, saying he wanted to give back that adult film. Once she was inside, he attacked her and, well, He hanged her from the rafters.
Oh my gosh, that's awful. And what about David? Did he just stand there and watch?
David said he tried to talk Dan out of it, but he ended up going along with it because he was scared. He said he saw the murder and then helped Dan clean up, get rid of the body, and ditch the car. They even admitted to watching those crime shows, like CSI, to learn how to hide what they did.
Wow, that is chilling. They actually used ideas from TV shows to cover up a real murder. It's crazy, but I guess it shows how far people will go when they're desperate.
It definitely shows how pop culture can influence crime, giving people ideas and even ways to try to get away with it.
But even with this confession, there were still questions, right? Like, could they really trust David? Why would he blame his own brother?
Absolutely. The investigators knew they couldn't just take David's word for it. They had to double-check his story and see if he was believable. So they gave him a polygraph test, a lie detector.
Did he pass?
He passed the questions about the murder itself. But when they asked about other people being involved, especially Roseanne, things got a little fuzzy.
So they still weren't sure about Roseanne.
Nope. Even with those iffy polygraph results, the prosecutors decided to drop the charges against Roseanne because they didn't have enough proof. They couldn't say for sure she was involved, but a lot of people still think she knew more than she let on.
So where does that leave us? David confesses, Roseanne's off the hook, and now Dan is facing serious charges. What's the next chapter in this story?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The prosecutors had to build their case, mostly based on clues and David's word, which was a tough spot to be in. So they offered David a deal.
What kind of deal?
Testify against Dan, and you get a shorter sentence. It was a risky move, but they knew they needed David's testimony to convince the jury that Dan was guilty.
So the stage is set for this dramatic showdown between twin brothers. It's like something out of Greek tragedy.
It really is. Identical twins with a lifetime of shared experiences, suddenly on opposite sides of a murder trial. The stakes couldn't be higher.
I can't even imagine being in that courtroom. We'll get into all the details of the trial in the next part of our deep dive, but for now, let's leave our listeners with this. Could you, sitting on that jury, convict someone with only circumstantial evidence and the word of a guy who already admitted he was involved? We left off with David agreeing to turn against his own twin, Dan, in exchange for a lighter sentence. Talk about a tough choice. I can't imagine the pressure he must have felt.
It was a huge turning point, a gamble for both sides. The prosecutors were betting on David's testimony to nail Dan, and David was putting his own future on the line, hoping for a break.
And you can't ignore the emotions involved. These are twins, they've shared their whole lives, and now they're facing off in court over a murder charge.
The psychology of it all is mind-boggling. It makes you think about how strong that twin bond really is, where loyalty ends, and how conflicted David must have been to betray his own brother.
So let's jump ahead to the trial. What was the mood like in the courtroom?
Oh, you could cut the tension with a knife. Everyone there knew this was a tragic and strange case. A family desperate for justice, lawyers trying to make sense of all these clues, and these identical twins, their lives tangled up in this whole drama.
And in the middle of it all, you have David on the witness stand pointing the finger at his own twin. Did his testimony live up to what the prosecutors were hoping for?
David gave a really detailed and honestly scary account of Heather's murder. He stuck to the story he told the police, Dan's plan, the attack in the garage, the cover-up, everything. It was a powerful moment. Everyone in the courtroom was hanging on his every word.
But I bet Dan's lawyers didn't just sit there and take it. What was their plan?
They went after David's credibility hard, saying he couldn't be trusted and had a reason to lie. They claimed Dan was innocent and that David was the one who actually did it, maybe because he was obsessed with Heather. They pointed out parts of David's story that didn't quite add up and reminded everyone that he'd been violent with a previous wife.
So they were trying to flip the script, make David look like the dangerous one, the unstable twin.
Exactly. They basically said David made up this whole story to frame Dan and save his own skin. They kept saying there was no physical evidence tying Dan to the crime and that David had the chance and the motive to do it himself.
Did they bring up that David had flunked parts of his lie detector test?
Oh, yeah, they hammered that point. They reminded the jury that David had lied about some things, especially about whether other people were involved.
And what about the prosecutors? How did they fight back and try to make David seem more believable?
Well, they said that David had nothing to gain by falsely accusing Dan. They said he was actually risking a lot by confessing, and that him being willing to implicate himself showed he felt guilty and wanted justice for Heather. They also pointed out that some of the evidence, like the adult film and Dan's dating profile, backed up what David was saying.
Sounds like both sides had good points. This must have been a tough one for the jury to figure out. Did they ever hear about that alleged pact between the twins? The one where they supposedly agreed to kill each other's ex-wives?
That's an important detail. In the end, the judge decided not to allow that information in the trial, said it was too prejudicial. So the jury never heard about that supposed agreement, and some legal experts think it could have changed their minds.
Wow, that's a big piece of information to keep from the jury. I get why the judge might have worried about how it would influence them. So what happened when the jury went to deliberate? Were they able to come to a decision?
Oh, those deliberations were long and tough, just like the whole case. Some jurors didn't trust David's testimony. They thought his motives were shady and pointed out the inconsistencies the defense brought up. Others felt that even though he wasn't perfect, his confession and all the circumstantial evidence pointed to Dan being guilty.
So they were basically trying to decide if they believed a guy who admitted he was involved, or if all those little clues added up to enough proof. That's a heavy responsibility for any jury. What happened in the end?
After days of going back and forth, they came back with a mixed verdict. They found Dan guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and being an accessory, which meant they believed he helped plan and cover up Heather's death. But they couldn't agree on the biggest charge, first-degree murder, so it was a mistrial on that count.
A mistrial. So close, but no cigar for either side. How did Heather's family feel about this partial win?
They were heartbroken. It was clear they had waited almost 10 years for some kind of justice, going through so much uncertainty and pain, and then they got this unfinished result. They were relieved that Dan was being held responsible for what he did, but not getting a murder conviction left him feeling like it wasn't enough.
And Dan, was he okay with the outcome, or did he want to fight the remaining charge?
Well, he was looking at another trial and maybe life in prison if they found him guilty of first-degree murder. So he made a calculated decision to cut his losses and take a plea deal.
He pleaded guilty. To what?
He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. That meant no more trials and a slightly shorter sentence than he might have gotten from a jury.
So both twins ended up making deals, but for very different reasons.
That's right. David's deal got him on the stand against Dan, and Dan's deal kept him out of another trial and maybe a worse sentence. It shows how the justice system is a lot about strategy, making deals, and finding middle ground, and sometimes the whole truth gets lost in the shuffle.
And what about the sentences? How long did each brother end up serving?
Dan got 74 years for second-degree murder. David, because of his deal, got a much shorter sentence, only 12 years for helping get rid of Heather's body.
74 years compared to 12, that's a huge difference. It makes you think about how fair these plea deals really are, and if they really punish people based on how much they were involved.
It's a question people are still debating, legal experts and people who fight for justice in the system. Plea deals can be a quick way to wrap up cases and avoid long trials, but they can also leave people wondering if justice was really served, especially when you see such different punishments for people involved in the same crime.
So one twin goes free after 12 years, and the other is stuck in prison for who knows how long. Did either of them ever show any remorse? Admit they were sorry for what they did?
When they were sentencing David, he cried and apologized to Heather's family, said he was sorry for what he did and knew how much pain he'd caused. But Dan, he was a different story. He had a chance to speak, but he refused to apologize. It just made him look even more like a cold-hearted killer.
That must have been really tough for Heather's family. They deserve more than just a guilty verdict. They deserve to hear him say he was sorry for taking away their loved one.
You're absolutely right. Not getting a sincere apology can really hurt, especially from someone who took a life. It makes it that much harder to heal and move on.
So David did his time and got out on parole in 2020. Dan, though, he's still locked up, probably for the rest of his life. What about Heather's kids? What happened to them in all of this?
Jacob and Hannah, Heather's children, were just little kids when their mom disappeared. They ended up being raised by their grandparents, the Springers. They gave them a good, loving home after this awful tragedy.
It's a bittersweet ending to a case that was filled with darkness and loss. Justice might have been served legally, but the emotional wounds will probably stay with everyone forever. The DeWild case is a chilling example of how complicated family can be, how fragile trust is, and what can happen when jealousy, possessiveness, and the willingness to do the unthinkable spiral out of control.
It also shows how hard it is to find justice when the evidence isn't clear, and depends on how people remember and see things, which can be unreliable. Even with a confession and a conviction, there are still doubts, questions without answers, and a feeling that something's just not right about this whole case.
Okay, before we wrap things up, I want to go back to what you said earlier about how tough it is to build a case on circumstantial evidence. This wasn't a case with a smoking gun or DNA evidence. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces that didn't even fit together properly.
You got it. And it shows a big challenge in our legal system. We want justice, we want to hold people accountable for crimes, but we also believe in due process, which means you need proof that meets a really high standard.
And in this case, the prosecutors had to walk a tightrope. They couldn't just rely on Dan confessing or find clear physical proof that he did it. They had to build their case on what David said, which wasn't super reliable, and a bunch of little clues that, while suspicious, might not have been enough to get a first-degree murder conviction on their own.
That's why they made that plea deal, even though it might feel a little off to some people. It guaranteed they got a conviction, made sure Dan was punished, and gave Heather's family some sense of closure.
It just goes to show that justice isn't always black and white. Sometimes it's messy and involves making tough choices and seeing things from different angles. And in cases like this, where the truth is murky and people's motives are unclear, those compromises can be tough to accept.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if David had kept quiet. Would Dan have gotten away with it? Would the truth about Heather's disappearance have stayed hidden forever?
Those are questions we'll never know the answer to. But one thing's for sure. When David decided to speak up, to tell the secret he'd been keeping for so long, it changed everything. It proves that even in the darkest situations, someone choosing to tell the truth, to break free from loyalty and silence, can be a powerful force for good.
And it shows how important it is to fight for justice, not just for the victims, but for everyone and for the system itself.
So we've really dug deep into this case, haven't we? From a missing wife to a brother's confession and then a trial where twin turned against twin. But that question we asked earlier just keeps coming back to me. If you were on that jury, could you actually convict someone based only on those little clues and the word of a guy who admitted he helped cover it up?
That question hung over the whole trial. Without any solid proof directly linking Dan to the murder, the prosecutors had their work cut out for them. They had to make the jury believe that all those bits and pieces, all those clues, really added up to him being Yahtzee without a doubt.
And then there's David's testimony. He's a tough one to figure out, right? I mean, he admits he helped, but he's also known to be a bit of a liar and maybe even had a reason to shift the blame. How much can we really trust what he said?
That's the tricky part, isn't it? David's confession gave us important details about what happened to Heather, but no one was sure if they could believe him. The defense did a good job of pointing out holes in his story and asking why he might want to lie. It became a game of who do you believe, could the jury see through the lies?
It really shows how hard it is to rely on what people say they saw, especially when they have a reason to lie to protect themselves.
No doubt about it. Memories are tricky things. They can change over time. People can be influenced. And then you add the emotional baggage of a case like this, families, betrayals. It gets really hard to know what really happened.
And we can't forget about those plea deals both brothers took. David cooperated and got a shorter sentence, while Dan avoided a possible life sentence by pleading guilty to a lesser charge. But it makes you think about what justice really means.
Plea deals are pretty common in our legal system. They help speed things up and make sure someone's held accountable. But they can also leave you with a nagging feeling that something's not quite right, like things weren't completely fair.
Yeah, the difference in their sentences is pretty shocking. David gets out after 12 years, and Dan's stuck inside for who knows how long. It shows that justice isn't always about everyone getting the same punishment. It's more about legal maneuvering, evidence, and making deals.
It reminds us that the legal system tries to be fair, but it also has to be practical. Sometimes getting a conviction means making compromises, and that can lead to results that feel a little iffy, even if it gets the job done.
We've talked a lot about the legal stuff, but we can't forget about the human side of it all. Heather's family went through years of not knowing, followed by this long, drawn-out legal battle. They never gave up on getting justice, even through all the heartache, which shows just how much they loved her and wanted those responsible to pay for what they did.
Their story shows how much damage violent crime can do. It's not just the victim. It tears apart families and whole communities. Getting justice becomes part of trying to heal, and that can take a really long time.
And even with a conviction, even with some answers coming out during the trial, there are still those nagging questions. Did Roseanne really not know anything? How much was David really involved? And the biggest question of all, what could have made these twin brothers do something so horrible?
Those unanswered questions remind us that finding justice doesn't always mean finding all the answers. We can gather evidence, hear people's stories, and make legal decisions, but the whole truth about why people do things can be a mystery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the big things we want our listeners to think about? What lessons can we take away from this sad and confusing case?
I think it's important to remember that even when things seem impossible, fighting for justice is still worth it. Heather's family never lost hope. They kept pushing for answers. Their strength shows the power of love, determination, and believing that truth matters.
It also shows how important it is to think critically, to question the evidence and what people say, especially in a world where we're bombarded with information all the time. We need to be able to sort through it all, see things from different angles, and come to our own conclusions.
And lastly, I think this case reminds us that relationships can be fragile, and bad things can happen even in seemingly normal families. It's a reminder to appreciate the people in our lives, to pay attention to red flags, and to try to be understanding and communicate openly with each other.
We've covered a lot today, going through the ups and downs of a case that made us question everything about family, loyalty, and what justice truly means. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, we encourage you to learn more about the case, explore other true crime stories, or even talk about these complex issues with others. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, there's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to discuss as we continue to search for truth and understanding.